Well, hi, John. I am so glad that you were able to join me for this discussion today. I know that you've been working around the topic of Americans with Disabilities and the Act and the legalities and those sorts of things. And I really would love to share some of your thoughts right now with our GP Red Presents viewers. And so just to get started, can you give us a little bit of background, kind of your background and how you got to be doing what you're doing these days?
Sure, Teresa. I'd be happy to do that, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I earned my bachelor's degree and my master's degree at the University of New Mexico in recreation administration. So I started my career in Albuquerque as a center director. I really enjoyed that work and was eventually asked to develop the therapeutic recreation programs for the city. We had some isolated programs, but this was an attempt to put them together into a cohesive package. So I got to do that, and then I moved to Illinois and worked at two of the wonderful special recreation associations, the great model of collaborative service for people with disabilities. While I was doing that, I was always interested in civil rights, so I earned my law degree at night school at the Loyola University School of Law and graduated just about the same time the ADA was cooking up in Congress. So it was kind of right place at the right time. And today, actually for the last 12 and a half years, I've helped cities and counties and park districts comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, you do great work around the country. Can you talk a little bit just about the Illinois recreation associations? They're different than most states, so most viewers won't be familiar with that model. And maybe just an overview of what that is and how it's different than it is around the rest of the country?
Sure. It's a great model, and it is built on cooperation. So the Chicago suburbs have a lot of small suburbs of 4 to 10 to 15 to 20,000 people. And that suburb on its own is not likely going to be able to provide a lot of recreation opportunities for people with disabilities. So back in, holy cow, 1969, the Illinois General Assembly adopted legislation, the governor signed it, and it permits 2 or more park districts to join together to provide service for people with disabilities. And the best part is, if they agree to do this cooperatively, there is a special property tax levy that can be used only to fund recreation for people with disabilities.
Great. Well, so if I'm approaching you and I'm, say, a director for a smaller rural community, what are typically the things that you see as you come in to try and help there? What are the things that agencies really need to keep in mind at this point?
Well, from an ADA perspective, some of the ADA 101 tasks include you have to audit your existing facilities to make sure that parks and the one swimming pool in the community and the one golf course in the community and the one senior center in the community are indeed accessible to people who have disabilities. And then you have to put together a plan that phases out the retrofit work over a period of years. So if it is parks and recreation only, we typically recommend, it varies from community to community, but we typically recommend somewhere between 8 to 12 years for the retrofit schedule.
So I know the law came into effect which year? I can't remember what year that was, where agencies do have to have the plan, right?
Well, that's been a topic of discussion, for 30 years. The ADA became effective a little over 30 years ago. In theory, when it became effective in 1992, cities and counties and park districts had until 3 years later, January 26 of 1995, to make their entire infrastructure accessible. I think that's an unrealistic deadline. Very, very few cities met it, and very, very few cities or counties or districts could have met it as well. The 2010 standards did adopt recreation assets, though, and that piqued a lot of interest in the park and recreation community, obviously.
I think there's still, we see quite a few agencies out there who still don't have and have not done an audit or have not done a plan. I know that we often provide what we call a component-based inventory, where we're looking at every single thing like playgrounds, ball fields, all different types, trails, that agencies own and manage. So we use that inventory as an overall, and there's always a kind of a general ADA assessment. I mean, we work with landscape architects who are familiar with design around working with people with disabilities, but that's not the level of detail that we need quite often for the audit. And so what's different between a kind of a general inventory and the audit that you do?
The audit it results in all detail.
Okay.
We will see a site that's designed by an award-winning architect and it's a gold medal agency or a CAPRA agency, and the interface between design and construction is not as smooth as we would like it at every site.
Yeah.
So even at the newest sites, in fact, as an example, we had a $200 million high school that was built in a town I won't name, but our report of deficits was 60 pages long.
Yeah.
So
We see
it's all about the detail.
all the time. We go into agencies and we're doing an inventory and touring parks, and we'll see the most beautiful state-of-the-art playground that is out in the middle of a field that has absolutely no accessible walkway. And it's kind of, okay, yeah, you spend all this money on this feature, and this component, but you have no way for people to get there. And they may even have, the right flooring. They may have everything there, but you can't get there.
Yeah, that's one of our mottos, in a sense. Grass and dirt are never accessible surfaces. So there has to be kind of the equivalent of the yellow brick road that connects elements at a park.
Great. So are there other key considerations just in general that you would like agencies to keep in mind around these topics?
Well, I think the first is the access audit. The second is this phased retrofit schedule and actually implementing the schedule. But the third is that people with disabilities get to choose whether they want to participate in specialized programs or in the most integrated setting alongside people who are typically developing and don't have a disability.
Okay. So are you seeing, I mean, I know this has been evolving with our agencies for a long time. Do you have a rough idea of how many agencies are really meeting those goals, or do we still have a lot of people who are just, some people I know, some agencies barely scratch the surface, and that's unfortunate. And we see that, and a lot of it has to do with lack of resources or lack of knowledgeable personnel who may not be completely familiar with how to offer either facilities or programming. But I mean, what's your feel in terms of the industry overall of parks and recreation in the U.S.? How close are we?
Well, I think as an industry, the professionals in the industry have a pretty high accessibility and inclusion IQ. I think everybody, I don't want to say everybody, most people are well aware of the requirements.
That's great.
The issue becomes, how do I fund it? Is City Council going to give us the additional resources for a manager of inclusion? Is the county board going to give us resources for an access audit and transition plan? So we still see a lot of RFPs and RFQs from jurisdictions that 30 years after the ADA became effective that still haven't met ADA 101 type requirements.
Yeah. Well, and I know you're really helpful. I mean, if somebody calls you and says, hey, I want to do this, I believe in it, I just can't get the money. How do you answer that question? I know I get that call too.
Ask this year, then ask again next year, then ask again the year after that. There are some communities that have some innovative approaches. We just talked to a community in Michigan that has a partnership with a large hospital complex, and the hospital grants funds to the city for livability issues related to disability and health. So in effect, the hospital is going to pay for that community's access audit and transition plan.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, partnering, trying to get that money. Well, good. Well, I want to switch topics a little bit. I mean, obviously, as we talk today, we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just wanted to kind of hear from you, how is that affecting services and what you do?
Well, it's having a big impact because as park and recreation departments open up, then close, then open up again, they're still struggling with the mitigation issues. And I think the mitigation issues that we hear about the most with regard to COVID-19, I just heard this in North Carolina, it's kind of clever, the 3 W's, wear a mask, wait 6 feet apart from each other, and wash your hands frequently. By the way, I think I heard that a lot from my mom. It's funny that that's a public health goal today.
Yeah.
I think one of the other new things that is being talked about as a mitigation technique too is respiratory etiquette. I'll say that over again, is respiratory etiquette. So sneezing into your elbow instead of sneezing into your hand, or leaving the room if you have to sneeze. So there are some simple things that can address the spread.
So when you are, welcoming people with disabilities into your facility, I know often there more physical assistance is necessary, and I know that. So how do you approach that, in terms of being aware and having the right etiquette?
We've seen some pretty innovative approaches from some parks and recreation agencies. I think some agencies are still concerned about the threat to their own employees and the threat to their participants. But we've seen agencies double up, so they're not only wearing a mask, but they're wearing a face shield as well. So principally the mask is supposed to protect others from you if you're ill, but the face shield protects you from others who might not have a mask on. So we've seen that. We've seen some innovative programming approaches too. I think ADA Title II regulation is written very broadly, but it anticipates that there will be a point where a person with a disability may pose a direct threat of injury to somebody else. And I think that fits the COVID-19 scenario. If because of my disability or health condition, I can't wear a mask or I won't wear a mask, or I reach up and you're my staff leader in my camp cohort group and I tear your mask off your face, I've just broken the PPE rules. I've certainly gotten within 6 feet of you. And if I'm asymptomatic or symptomatic, I could be posing a direct threat to you. So I think in very broad language, the ADA to a certain extent addresses this already. I had a conversation with a supervisor at the Department of Justice, and she said, look, we want to make it clear to everybody, the ADA does not overrule COVID-19 restrictions that each of the states or each county or city may adopt. But those COVID-19 restrictions do not overrule the ADA. And I'm a firm believer in the ADA can coexist with COVID-19 just like it can coexist with safety and risk management issues, just like it can coexist with fiscal issues. So people who might believe that there is only one rule here to follow are mistaken. And instead, you've got to try to blend the two together.
So if I have staff, a programmer or coordinator who's working in the program, who has concerns, how would you just simply, how would you address that with them?
Well, the ADA have already set it out, and they call it the interactive process. So if your staff member has concerns that my son Jimmy might be symptomatic, then he raises the flag. Of course, before that, you already have protocols in place like taking my temperature, asking if anybody in my family's been exposed, asking if I've had a cough or unexplained diarrhea or muscle aches and all the other symptoms. So I think that screening is a critical part of it. But if your employee comes to you and says, I'm concerned about this one boy in camp, after you do an assessment of sorts, and that's going to require a trained staff person. So after you do an assessment of sorts, if you think there is direct threat, I think the ADA allows you to temporarily suspend participation by that person until they show they have a negative test result or until 14 days have gone by and they're symptom-free. It depends on the variables, like whether they're symptomatic or asymptomatic or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's really, really helpful. Are there any, I mean, you have so many great resources, and I know that, yeah, I see that your website's up there so people can be in contact with you directly. We'll make sure that, you know, people can reach you if they have more questions. But is there anything else that if you know, in this platform that you would like people to really keep in mind as we're talking about people with disabilities and how we can do it better in Parks and Recreation?
We're not out of the woods yet.
Mm-hmm.
Just this week, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Michigan State University, and Notre Dame all went virtual after less than, I think in one instance, less than 1 week of class, and in the other, less than 2 weeks of class. So we are not out of the woods. And I think the issue here is, if I were advising a Parks and Recreation professional, a center director, or a pool manager, I'd say, be flexible. Don't think one set of rules overrules the other. Learn as much as you can about the ADA and how to make reasonable modifications. There is a lot of literature and there are a lot of court decisions, unfortunately, that clarify what a modification a Parks and Recreation Department can make should be.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And one other thing that just occurred to me, I was reading about the fact that a lot of schools are not in session. And so what we're seeing around the country is that Parks and Recreation agencies, as we always do, you know, we pick up community need. What's happening is the Parks and Recreation centers are being opened during school time. And I guess I just wanted to ask if you see any special considerations, almost as if summer day camps are being extended through the year. I see some really creative ways that they are doing that. I'm not exactly sure how, if schools aren't in session, recreation centers can be, but at the same time, I'm seeing it all over the country right now. And because there's a need, you know, parents need to work, and that, and at the same time, they're calling them, like I saw one today that came across as virtual learning spaces at the recreation center. So the kids are actually doing their schoolwork at the center. And so there's just a lot of really interesting things happening right now. But I guess in terms of people with disabilities, do you see any impacts related to that type of aspect?
Well, I think if there's proper planning as to, well, like here in the Chicago suburbs, a park district is making its ice rinks, without the ice, of course,
right,
available for kind of an e-learning camp.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as everybody is spaced at least 6 feet apart at their workstations, as long as the staff have training on mitigation and how to deal with a person who has a disability that might have unusual behavior, like wandering, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with getting up and wandering. It only becomes wrong when you break that 6 foot bubble. There are plenty of ways to deal with that. So we've given some advice to a handful of Parks and Recreation departments about, if you're going to run fall e-learning programs, then do make sure that your staff know a little bit more about disability and behavior techniques.
Great. Well, so much good information. As always, you're just a fount of knowledge, and I really appreciate you taking the time today. Thanks so much. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
This is all doable. We saw, like I said, some really innovative approaches this summer, from Texas to Illinois to New Jersey to Oregon. Agencies are making it happen. So there's no reason to shy away from it. This is no different than the other challenges that Parks and Recreation professionals have met.